They will not leave disappointed. This guy is unique, special, and we are privileged to be here today.
We are slowly, almost at a glacial pace, moving into another era of Milwaukee Bucks basketball. Last season, the Bucks finished 48-34, good for 5th in the Eastern Conference. Giannis Antetokounmpo finished 3rd in MVP voting, while Damian Lillard turned back the clock in the second half of the season to push Milwaukee into the top 6. The Chris Middleton for Kyle Kuzma trade was a disappointing one as the Bucks said goodbye to a franchise legend, and in one horrifying moment, everything changed. Lillard tearing his Achilles during the postseason changed everything for the Bucks. While Indiana was set to win that series, the Bucks entered the offseason with a star player on a non-contending team and an anchor of a contract now that Lillard was set to miss the 2025-26 season. And yet, the Bucks' modest attempt at salvaging the Antetokounmpo era came with some free agency moves that shocked many. The addition of Miles Turner gave them another unicorn big man to replace Brook Lopez, and the return of Ryan Rollins plus a bunch of shooting created an opportunity for the Bucks to contend in the Eastern Conference this season. Despite the changes in the names, everything remains the same. The Milwaukee Bucks are largely going to play with Giannis, a unicorn big man, and multiple shooters around said duo. Miles Turner comes in from Indiana, quietly one of the better shooters in the league as a big man, also good at altering shots at the rim with his defensive ability, allows Milwaukee to operate within the same constraints that they had with Brook Lopez. And then you look at last year's roster, they added shooting, but they also retained most of their shooting. Bobby Portis, Taurean Prince, doesn't really do much but shoot threes, 42% of his threes last season. You get Gary Harris, who shot 41% of his threes. You add a bunch of shooting into the mix, and I think the Milwaukee Bucks are going to try to replicate the same things that they did last year. You look at even a guy like Ryan Rollins, who shot 40%. Kevin Porter Jr. shot 40%. Even Gary Trent Jr., who should be a starter, shot 41% from three. The plan for the Bucks is simple. Giannis runs everything, and when all else fails, he can kick out to an open shooter. And then on defense, you switch everything, allowing Miles Turner to kind of serve as their defensive fulcrum and safety valve at the back end. If there's one glaring weakness for the Milwaukee Bucks, it's that there's not many ceiling raisers on this team. Turner's in his prime years, Giannis is 30. The shooters are all within that 27 to 32 range. There's not a lot of young players on this roster, which leads to Ryan Rollins. Rollins is about 24 years old, and he potentially offers some upside for this team. You look, averaged 15.3 points, 4.7 rebounds, 4.6 assists, 2.5 stocks, shot 40% from three. Overall, true shooting percentage is 60% and shot 75% at the rim. This is the type of player that I think should get more minutes with this Milwaukee roster. He opted out of his deal. The Bucks kind of haggled, and then they re-signed him to a 3-year, $12 million deal. While there are guys that can play on this roster like Cole Anthony and Kevin Porter Jr., I think Ryan Rollins possesses the best ability to give this team some upside, and putting him into starting point guard position gives them a look that they haven't had in quite some time. I'm a fan of Ryan Rollins, and I think he should be the starter for the Milwaukee Bucks. Overall, I think this is a good spot for where the Bucks are right now as a team. The 6th best team in the Eastern Conference, so they don't land into the play-in. Giannis is too good for that. I think this is a perfect season for Giannis to win MVP. I think he'll obviously have the opportunities to do so. There's just an opportunity for him to score, an opportunity for rebounds, overall be the franchise guy, create a lot of shots, generate a lot of offense, be the defensive fulcrum alongside Miles Turner. I have the Bucks 6th in the conference, and I think they're going to be an okay team that makes the first round, and then more questions come once they get eliminated. One of the biggest turnarounds in NBA history, the Detroit Pistons went from a franchise lost to a franchise that looks like it has one of the more brighter futures in the league. Cade Cunningham took a step forward last year as a player who was considered a generational talent coming out of Oklahoma State. He started to live up to that potential, leading the Pistons to the playoffs. Jalen Duren, of their young players, Jalen Duren was probably the most interesting, taking a step forward from a big man who can dunk the basketball to more of a presence defensively. And all in all, the Pistons kind of kept everything together. They have their young core of talent. They added proper veterans and shooting around Cunningham to make things work. And now that we see the Pistons move from a team that was at the bottom of the league to a 44-win team, the next question is, where do they go from here? And how fast do they go from here? Last season, the Pistons made a couple of offseason moves. They added Tim Hardaway Jr., Tobias Harris, Malik Beasley. They added veteran guys who can do specific things on the floor. This year, they did much of the same thing. They added Duncan Robinson and Karis LeVert. I think this is a good move. I think what you do there is you take some of the shooting supplemented by losing Beasley, by losing Hardaway Jr., and regain it with Robinson. Duncan Robinson's one of the elite three-point shooters in the league, not just because of his percentages, but because of the volume that he shoots at. So I think he's someone who you can put in at the forward spot, and he's a floor spacer within itself. And I think that's great that you essentially replaced Beasley with a guy who can do the same things and probably a little bit better at shooting. I think he's a worse defender. I think Beasley in a specific way is a better defender, but Robinson is pretty good. As for Karis LeVert, he replaces that Tim Hardaway Jr. role where there's some shooting in his game. He shot 37% from three on medium volume, but also some creation off the dribble. I think that's a big thing. I think LeVert is more of a playmaker, creator type than Hardaway Jr., whereas Hardaway, his attacks are more based for him to score the basketball. I think Karis LeVert adds another passing element in the second unit. So overall, I think these two moves will be good. And then more importantly, you look at the young guys on this roster, it doesn't really hamper them, right? Jaden Ivey's still going to play, Ausar Thompson, Ron Holland, we'll talk about them in a minute. Those guys are still effectively in the rotation, and you're not taking minutes away from them while supplanting Cade, Ivey, Duran, and Harris with great shooting and great creation off the dribble. I like this move for Detroit. A little bit of a repeat in doing the same thing they did before, but adding good veteran players to a team that's on the rise. I like it. Ultimately, the most interesting thing about the Detroit Pistons is going to be how they manage their young group of players. I removed Jalen Duren from this group because I think Duren's going to get a contract extension. I think he's locked in after the season he had before. The three guys I'm interested in, Ausar Thompson, Ron Holland, Jaden Ivey. Holland, the youngest of the three, I think he's still a work in progress. He had a couple of good shots last season, but wasn't a great three-point shooter. A monster athlete. I think he's someone that's going to take a considerable step forward this upcoming season in a smaller role, so you won't see the numbers pop like they're supposed to, but I think he'll be an effective player. Ausar Thompson, as much love Amen Thompson gets, I think Ausar needs more love. Just an elite athlete, freakish defender. You know, he got crossed over by Jalen Brunson in that Pistons game in the playoffs, but getting that responsibility in year two, that's impressive in itself, right? I think Thompson's going to be an interesting player, much like his brother Amen. They both have to improve as shooters, but Thompson is going to be, to me, the guy that takes that next step forward and becomes the focal defender and wing player for this Pistons team. I just worry if the offense never gets there. But he's taking strides and he's playing well. I think he's a key piece to this team's future. Jaden Ivey I'm stuck on, right? And this is not because he's a bad player. It's the other way. It's Ivey came in the same year as Duren, and now the Pistons have to pay him as well. He averaged 17.6 points. He attacked the basket. You think about where he was 2 years ago, where he was getting benched, to last season being a focal point of that secondary offensive unit before his injury. I like Jaden Ivey a lot. I just wonder if he is a piece for the Pistons long-term on the roster, or if he's going to be a piece the Pistons use to make a big trade this upcoming season. You look at guys like Lauri Markkanen, who actually is a weirdly good fit for this Pistons team. He can create his own shots. He could dunk. He's a dunker, shooter, and he has that size. He can play up and attack defenses that play a little bit smaller. Is Ivey a piece there? You know, if a star player becomes available, does Ivey become a lead piece in a trade? I think the Pistons have a great young core here, good future. I'm just curious to see if they're pieces for this iteration of the Detroit Pistons, or if they're pieces used to make the next great Pistons team. But all three are great players, and if kept, a really young talented core put around Cade Cunningham and Jalen Duren. Success and development aren't linear, right? And I think that's the most important thing that you got to understand with the Detroit Pistons is they're going to go from one of the worst teams in the league. I think they won 16, 18 games. They had a historic losing streak to 44 wins. And in that time span, people went from, oh, the Detroit Pistons are in town to, oh, the Detroit Pistons are in town. That change in the vernacular, that change in the inflection represents there's just a different feeling with this Detroit team. Now that they've seen them win 44 games, they're not going to be taken lightly. And I think ultimately this is going to be a consolidation season for the Pistons. I think we'll know more about them from this season than last season just because I think we're going to be able to ask the question, is Cade Cunningham ready to take another step forward? Is Jalen Duren ready to take another step forward? How do we figure out the cauldron of these young guys? What are we doing about the veterans that they have on this roster? JB Bickerstaff, I think in Cleveland, JB Bickerstaff got hit with the bug that he was good but not good enough to take that Cleveland team to the next step. Does that kind of ring in Detroit? Or because the Pistons were a team that kind of was lost over the last decade or so, does this team get a little bit more rope in terms of that development process? Ultimately, they intrigue me as a team in the world of not winning a playoff series, right? If they just make it to the first round and they do exactly what they did last year, how are we viewing this Pistons team? I am of the mind that the Pistons are the fifth best team in the Eastern Conference, easily to me. And I think they're going to be good, but I do wonder what the conversation about them is moving forward. They have a handful of young talent. They have a top 20, top 15 player in Cade Cunningham. You have a good defensive core. You largely won out with the veterans that you've signed, and you're not signing them to monster deals. You're not signing them to long-term deals. You're keeping everything effectively close in the same phylum in terms of years. What's the next step for the Detroit Pistons? I feel like that's the biggest question that we will have at the end of this season. But for right now, I have them as the number 5 team in the Eastern Conference. And I think they're going to take one of New York, Orlando, or Atlanta to a tough first-round series. Has a team ever made a 180 quite like the Atlanta Hawks? It's an interesting question to ask, right? I feel like from every perspective, you look at the Hawks trying to change their overall perception in 1 year. They finished 40 and 42 last season, middle of the pack, 18th in offensive rating, defensive rating, they were 19th. The Trae Young conversation turned into a weird one. It turned into a, when does Trae leave Atlanta, to is Trae really that good? They had the number 1 pick sandwiched in between Cooper Flagg and Victor Wembanyama. They felt like a team that never really got back from not repeating the success of that Eastern Conference Finals appearance nearly 7 years ago. But when you look at this past offseason, I think they really nailed everything they needed to do to take a step forward, and I kind of like them moving forward for this upcoming season. Before you talk about the additions on the roster, I think the most important thing that we need to discuss is the internal improvement of players on the roster or who are already there. Jalen Johnson and Zachariah Risache, 2 players that I think are going to take steps forward this upcoming season. Jalen Johnson, really good, got hurt, but before that he averaged 18, 10, 5, 2.5 stocks, and a true shooting percentage of 56%. Underrated passer, athletic, finishes at the rim, can shoot the ball a little bit. I want to see him take another step forward. There's room for a shooting leap, and of course he needs to stay healthy, but this is a guy that we're looking at and saying he can be a special player in this league, all-star level, and they got him on a cheap extension as well. I think as much as we talk about Atlanta's offseason additions, Jalen Johnson and his ability to play the 3 and the 4, effectively giving them a trident of Johnson, Onyeka Okongwu, Kristaps Porzingis that can all kind of float and rotate within each other. I think that's going to make the Hawks a really good team this upcoming year. And then Zachariah Risache, unfairly, the number 1 pick in a draft between Victor Wembanyama and Cooper Flagg, 2 generational talents, but wasn't bad last year. 12 points per game, 3.5, nearly 4 boards per game, shot 35% from 3. I think he looked good at the Eurobasket for France. I think the biggest thing we need to see with Risache is a little bit more on-ball creation, We need to see him improve a little bit more as a defender. He has the tools to be an effective defender. He's not an elite athlete, but he's a really good athlete. I'm just wondering if he can put that all together. And, of course, can he take another step forward as a shooter? Can he go from a good shooter as a rookie to a great shooter, also on high volume, right? I think that's going to be the interesting thing. I look at Jalen Johnson and Zachariah Risacher as two players that are going to take considerable leaps forward this upcoming year, which makes the Atlanta Hawks an even more dangerous team. And, of course, the offseason addition for the Atlanta Hawks, Kristaps Porzingis, injured last season, missed a lot of time near the back end of the season, but perfect fit for the Atlanta Hawks, right? You can play him at the 4, you can play him alongside of Nick Okongwu, you can play him at the 5, you can have some strong offensive-minded lineups with Jalen Johnson and Kristaps Porzingis 4-5. You can have some interesting lineups, I think, with Onyeka Okongwu and his ability as a passer. Really, Okongwu's an underrated player now, especially if he's moving to the bench because of his passing ability, but Okongwu and Porzingis really stifle teams defensively with their ability to not only just stuff him at the rim, but also like Okongwu's movement as a defender. I just think that's an interesting 4-5 combination, but Porzingis provides the outside shooting, the rim protection, roster flexibility. I think he's going to be a really talented player for Atlanta, and if he can stay healthy, he'll make all the difference in the world. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, his per 36 minutes I put up on the board a little bit better, 13.4, 4.6 rebounds, 3.9 assists. I think that gives you an idea of what you're getting, right? You're getting secondary creation, you're getting outside shooting, perimeter defense, experience. He's been in back-to-back conference finals, and another perimeter threat on the wing defensively with Zachariah Risacher and Dyson Daniels. I like that. And then Luke Kennard. Luke Kennard's a secondary creator, elite outside shooter, doesn't do much else. I look at that move more of as an 82-game move than a 16-game move. He's someone that I think will be maybe a little bit of a backup point guard who can create some shots, generate some outside shooting, and just use that gravity and levity to generate some shots for the Atlanta offense. But I think as the Hawks move up and as we start to see them play tougher opponents, I think Kennard's minutes go down a little bit. The shooting will be welcomed, but the defensive woes and miscues, I think, will be something that hinders him. For 1 year, perfect move. These three, plus Trae Young, plus Jalen Johnson and Zachariah Risacher, I'm interested. I'm in. When talking about the Atlanta Hawks, I think the first thing I wanted to mention here is their new general manager, Ansi Salah. A very strong first season in encapsulating what the Hawks needed, right? This was a small basketball team
Harrison Matthews has
that didn't really have an identity outside of Trae Young being one of the offensive.
Feet off the bounce, connects on a 3.
Now you go and you add size, flexibility, defensive versatility.
Missed threes. Crews starting to tightening here on Orlando as Gay springs free for the dunk. Daniels with the dish.
We even consider the fact that they made the trade, right? I don't really care about the Pelicans trade just because I think that's something to look forward to down the line. But
Alexander Walker in and out. DiVincenzo back out McDaniels. Alexander Walker on the drive, goes inside, lays it up and in.
More of a motor guy, but having that asset and turning it into a potentially bigger asset down the line, I think that just encapsulates what the Hawks are now as a team. And I'm curious to see what Salah does moving forward in terms of supplanting Trae Young in this core with talent. And I'm curious to see what this team does moving forward. I think I have them 4th in the Eastern Conference. I like the Hawks overall as a team that sneaky contender in the Eastern Conference to me, and it wouldn't shock me if they outkick their coverage here and maybe make it to the second round, maybe even the Eastern Conference Finals if all things break right.